Hello and welcome to another episode of the Republic of Ezo. I am your host, Zach Yost. So if this is your first time joining us, I'd encourage you to check out the first episode where I discuss what the Republic of Ezo is and what I mean when I say that this show is about humanism. But for now, I'm very excited that the show has our first guest today, and that is Dr. Luke Sheahan, who is without a doubt one of the foremost living authorities on the work of sociologist Robert Nisbet. And today he'll be telling us all about Robert Nisbet's work on community and what some current events such as COVID, what insights Robert Nisbet's work might have for thinking about that, as well as his recently released book, Why Associations Matter, The Case for First Amendment Pluralism, which I actually reviewed for the Mises Wire when it came out back in 2020, I think it was, so I'll link to that in the show notes page. But Luke is also the president of the Academy of Philosophy and Letters, which will be having its annual meeting coming up in June in Maryland, right outside D.C., and he'll be telling us what that's all about, and he'll also share his thoughts on the state of academia and give those of you who are thinking about applying to grad school some things to think about while you do so. So let's get started. So thanks so much for being here today, Luke. I really appreciate you coming on the show. And as I mentioned before to listeners, Luke is one of the smartest people I know when it comes to Robert Nisbet and community. And I really think that libertarians and classical liberals could really gain a lot from learning more about Robert Nisbet and his thoughts. And Luke's here today to tell us some more about that. So why don't you introduce yourself, Luke, and just take it away. Why is Robert Nisbet important, and why should libertarians check him out?
All right, thank you, Zach, for having me. Yeah, so my name is Luke Sheahan. I'm an assistant professor in the political science department at Duquesne University, and I do a lot of work on freedom of association and other First Amendment rights, and a lot of work on what I think is one of the premier thinkers of the 20th century, Robert Nisbet. So Robert Nisbet was a sociologist. He spent his career at a number of academic institutions. He started off at Berkeley, where he did both his undergraduate and graduate work, finishing in 1939. Then he served there as a professor for a number of years. In 1953, he moved to a new campus in the UC system at Riverside, where he was the dean. He was in administration for a decade or so. Then he went back into teaching and scholarship in the early 1960s. He had a stint at the University of Arizona and then at Columbia University, where he held the very prestigious chair there in the social sciences. Finally finishing his career as an adjunct scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. And he delivered the 1987 Jefferson Lecture, which is the most prestigious award bestowed by the federal government. So he was really at the very top of the academic world. So holding prestigious academic positions, as well as publishing at Oxford University Press, at the very top of the academic publishing houses. And he was even said to be, while he was alive anyway, the most cited public intellectual in America. So very much a kind of core fixture in academia, holding your run-of-the-mill academic posts and as dean and as research professor, academic chair. He was president of the Pacific Sociological Association, these sorts of things, as well as having a very important place in our kind of public discourse. So his books were read by Bill Buckley, Russell Kirk. He and Russell Kirk had a long and very, very fruitful friendship. They kind of saw each other as not the same, but as fellow travelers. They were both kind of part of the same broad project, talking about conservatism broadly, but also at least a conservatism that focused on culture and society as opposed to simply politics.
And if I'm remembering correctly, one major difference between them is that Nisbet was actually an atheist, wasn't he?
He was, he was, and I don't know if he was an atheist. He was certainly an agnostic. He was not, he did not have the religious button. It just wasn't there. So I don't know that he ever said explicitly what he was. It just is there kind of in its absence. His daughter wrote an article about him, and she just said he just didn't have the religion button. It just wasn't a part of him. His father was a Presbyterian, and his mother was a Christian Scientist. Okay. So I think he grew up in a home where kind of mixed religions, so they didn't talk about it a lot. And also he was delivered at home because his mother, of course, didn't believe in using medical science. And I think the type of mind that Nisbet had, he didn't really take it seriously in kind of an ultimate sense. It just didn't seem to have that button. He was a big disciple of Emil Durkheim, and Durkheim's one of his famous contributions is seeing the importance of community, but religion being simply, or not simply, I guess it's not simple, this concept, but a way of articulating in abstract terms the core essential nature of community. And so community is such a kind of for Durkheim as well as for Nisbet, it's such a concrete manifestation of our relationships that we cannot escape from, that it's hard not to want to put it in something more than just a psychological satisfaction, because it is more than that. And so one way human beings have always done this is through religion. They kind of articulate it in this kind of as kind of some divine sanction to what we're doing together. So I think Nisbet just saw it that way. That's what religion is doing, is it's explaining to us why we need each other, because we can't really articulate just how core community is. And so we kind of need something higher to aim at, but it's not true in any real sense. That was Durkheim's view, and he was an atheist. And I think it was Nisbet's view as well. Although Nisbet doesn't quite say that. He never says he's an atheist.
And I find it just Nisbet, as well as a whole bunch of kind of, I guess you might call them mid-century sociologists, seem to be just completely different birds, as it were, from contemporary sociology. It seems like the field seems to be almost an entirely different field compared to where it used to be. And I find, not that I've read too much contemporary sociology, but just Nisbet and like Frank Tannenbaum and others, I find them to be very readable and very applicable to life in general, whereas I get the impression contemporary sociology just is not necessarily, but again, I'm not super read on it, but just completely different from, like, I don't want readers to get the wrong, listeners to get the wrong idea. Oh, sociology, crazy wokeness or something like that. He's practically a different field, it seems, almost.
Yeah, so it's the way I had it explained to me is, Nisbet became, quite a big deal in sociology. One thing about him is he described himself as a philosophical conservative, although there's a pretty big debate over where we should actually categorize him. So a number of classical liberals claim him as their own, that he really fits into classical liberalism. He just didn't acknowledge it till quite, the 1980s, quite late in his life and quite late in his career. But one thing about him is he was not an ideologue. And so he got along perfectly well with Marxists in the field and perfectly well with liberals. And he just got along with all of them. He just wasn't an ideologue. He could edit books with them. He could work on them in conferences. He just didn't see it as a problem. Even while in his writing, he could be critical. He just didn't seem to have quite that button, I guess, in terms of getting kind of tribal in where he fit in ideologically. And I think he just really was his kind of primary identity was as a scholar and a thinker. And so it didn't bother him that somebody disagreed or was in a different philosophical camp. It just didn't bother him at all.
Yeah,
Kind of wish there were
another
more
way
like that.
he's an endangered species these
Yes.
days, in a
Yes.
way. um, so when it comes to community, when it comes to Nisbet, I've read Quest for Community and love that, and I really, really, really love his really short book, The Present Age, which has influenced my thinking a great deal, and I think it's a really helpful tool, and I've recommended it to tons of people, and you can read it for free on the Liberty Fund website. So what would you say, so I'm curious for what you think Nisbet would say about the state of community today, and then for your own analysis of how things are going. Because it seems to me we're really, in the sociological sense, community is in deep trouble, atomization and all that. And I'm not sure that a lot of the people who talk about it have any solutions at all, or if they do, that they're in the realm of realistic. So what are your thoughts regarding
Yeah,
that?
so Nisbet published his first book, The Quest for Community, in 1953, and it's a little. He has he's very down about the state of things. He thinks communities are in decline. Including he thinks all kind of major non-political institutions are in decline. So he has, a section on the family. The family is in decline. It's virtually meaningless and functionless. He's writing this in 1953.
Yeah.
You're kind of like, wait a second, I thought that was the heyday of the family.
Yeah.
And he's looking around and he's seeing that any praise, you can see kind of Hegel has a great line where he says, the Ala Minerva flies at dusk. So meaning when we start talking a lot about something, that's probably because it's on its way out. And we only are understanding it kind of philosophically as it's leaving us. When we're in the midst of it, we don't actually understand it. When it's in the becoming for us. The kind of praise of the family, and the praise of, it says, praise of the role of mother. The reason this is happening is because these are meaningless institutions, that all education is happening in the public schools. Employment education is happening elsewhere. Employment's outside the home. It's not, the agricultural community's gone away. So the family serves basically no purpose other than to, at least for now, provide a roof over people's heads, although it's not clear that's necessary. There are other roofs you can be under. There are other places that can give you food. It's kind of unclear what exactly the family does anymore. And he's writing this in 1953. He says it's functionless, and it's on its way out. And of course, this is just prior to just 2 decades later, you start to see a major kind of rise in the divorce rates, and the kind of family publicly very much starts to come apart at the seams. But he sees it. He sees it because it lost its function. It doesn't serve a purpose economically or politically, just as kind of a meaningless thing that we still pay homage to. As it turns out, and he points out, all of these associations, when they lose their functions, it doesn't mean we don't need them. We've just something else usurped them. And in most times, he sees that as the political state. The state starts its educational institutions. So now it performs that function. It's not performed by religious institutions. It's not performed by the family. It will educate people, from starting at 4 or 5 or 3. That's what we're pushing for these days. Take them out of the home and educate them all the way through, including, home ec classes, auto classes. Like, it will do everything that you need. The state will provide it through its educational apparatus. And, so the state kind of usurps it. The problem is the state cannot actually provide psychological function. It can't actually provide relationships between people. And people absolutely need those things. But those things have to be connected to real functional economic and political, meaningful social ties. So you can't just have a family that we feel good together. There has to be a real economic reason that we're with each other. We actually help each other out. We depend on each other in more real sense than a family reunion, but actually be tied to each other, or else it becomes too ephemeral and it actually doesn't perform its psychological function. Now, the problem is the state can't perform the psychological functions. You end up with these alienated individuals who are kind of bereft of any real social ties, but human beings can't exist there. They have to have social ties. So they start finding them in radical ideologies and charismatic political figures. which becomes very, very dangerous. So he sees totalitarianism as rising kind of after you end up with an atomized populace. These people are disconnected. They have nothing else to look to except for the Führer. That guy's promised a real community.
Yes,
and they turn to him.
That was one of the things I took away from the quest for community, was his insight into how people need some sort of something to provide them existential meaning, and how increasingly they get that through these radical politics and things like that. And it seems to me we get that to a lesser extent today, but where I mean, it's very much everyone in their own corner of, we have to own the libs, or, the conservatives are evil Nazis and all that. And it's a very vulgar form of tribalism, it seems to me, where, yes, you have your team on Twitter that you go and, troll people with every day, or whatever on social media, but that's kind of sad. It's not in any way providing deep meaning that we need as social beings and all that. And I mean, I think people were way too scared about Trump being Hitler. I think, to me, it seems there's the possibility that there actually will be the conditions are there where there could be a dangerous figure like that in the future, and we'll be like, oh, good old Trump days back.
Right.
But so what, this has been a big topic of discussion among people on the right, with the kind of post-liberals and the integralists, and it's kind of a spectrum of people who love to trash the market as being kind of one of the things that has led to this atomization. And from my reading of them, they think the state would be the solution to fixing all of this. And sometimes they even cite Nisbet as being, on their side, and yet they also love the state. So I find that a bit confusing. But in general, I just find their solutions to not be very practical. And I think the extent of the impracticality depends on who you're talking to. Some people, the trads, seem to think we can go back to living pastoral, happy village life, and that's feasible and what we should be doing. So I'm curious for your take on the post-liberals, but also for your thoughts on how community can be revitalized, as it were, given that contemporary, modernized technological life is probably not going to go away. And if it did, the population of the earth would have to greatly shrink. So just what can we do about it, do you think? And what do you think about some of the solutions that have been put forward?
Yeah. So, we're still grappling with the ramifications of technological changes that we've seen just in the last few decades, let alone, the information kind of economy, but also the internet and then social media. I heard a great presentation some years ago, and it was talking about how it takes years and years for the ramifications of technology to work themselves out. So when you have the invention of the video camera, and you can go from watching plays and having to go to watching them on video. At first, they just record the play, right? They just record the play, and then it takes a while to occur to people. They can stop the video recording and edit it together. That takes a while to figure out. Then they realize they can move the camera around. You don't just have to go straight on. You can move it down and up. So the great kind of cinematography innovations that are made by Orson Welles and Citizen Kane. But it takes a while to think of that. So it's the same thing with social media. We're somewhere in the middle of figuring it out. So at first we thought it was great. We were all going to be connected, but then we realized that also connected like toxic political radicals to each other, which it gave microphone, we said it would give microphones to normal people, but it gives microphones to, really toxic people too. It turns out it was very much a mixed bag. And one thing that almost no one saw coming was the way in which it disconnected people. It's a false form of community. Nisbet would have seen that from the beginning. I mean, there's sections of Quest for Community that you would think he was talking about Facebook if he wrote it today. So he talks about the superficial symbols of friendship, That's what Facebook friends are. It's
Yeah.
super. Now we're friends on Facebook and we like each other's stuff, but we don't actually do anything. We don't actually know each other. And so it ends up being a way that it takes the place of us actually liking to each other and actually knowing each other as friends. And instead, we scroll on Facebook and like stuff, or Instagram or Twitter or whatever your drug of choice is. And we didn't really see that was going to be a disconnect. At first, everyone praised it, and then it was a decade before we realized that it was less than a decade really. We realized that it had created a problem, and we were in too deep. At least with my generation, millennials, we got it in college. I'm an older millennial. I got it in Facebook in college, and it was kind of thank God I wasn't born later. That's all I have to say. It ended up being it was kind of too late. We're all in too deep, and we're not quite sure what to do about it. But I think one thing to think about is a lot of the voluntary associations that Putnam talks about and Nisbet talks about, a lot of them, we talk about how they were created in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So the way to think about this is Tocqueville's America that he sees in the 1830s, with all their voluntary associations that he talks about, it gets that and the agricultural economy, it starts to get shredded. You have a massively destructive civil war, which is always destructive to communities. And then you have industrialization, and it kind of shreds Tocqueville's America. But the social fabric starts to be rewoven in these new voluntary associations that come into being, labor unions, anything from labor unions to the Boy Scouts to the Rotary Club. All of these things come into existence just in like 2 decades, almost all of them. This is a kind of extraordinary social entrepreneurship that takes place there in the early 20th century and late 19th century. And I think what we can see is then they start to decline, and there's debate, of course, over why that is. And Nisbet makes the case it's the rise of the political state. I think it's very persuasive. He also, certain aspects of our economy, we end up relating to each other not substantively, but just through what he calls the cash nexus.
Yeah.
Which can be, it's just is not very close. It's not real relationships that come out of that. But what we might be looking at and thinking about are ways in which community can be reformed in the new era. So we say that, there's this kind of, all this technology keeps us apart, but there might be a way in which it connects us in ways we haven't quite figured out yet, or it's happening, but it's happening kind of on the DL. So a lot of people, who are trying to revive sort of an agricultural way of living, which isn't really realistic given technological advances and the needs of food. Nonetheless, some of them can do it because they can be in contact with each other. So you do have these people who can return to the land, and it actually works because of information technology, because of the internet. So they can actually do it. They can sell their stuff online. So it actually, then it actually works. They can have their small community, which would not be able to support their farm, but because of the internet, it does support their farm. So it's there's new
everyone
ways of
living
coming
a
into
modern
being.
technological life subsidizes everyone who wants to homestead.
Yes.
And I wanted to go back real quick to talking about social media and the generational thing, because I'm a younger millennial, and Facebook, for instance, has been really helpful to me in staying in contact with people all around the country and the world who share similar interests and all that. There are lots of downsides. And I find it helpful. It facilitates in-person, it can be used to facilitate in-person community down the road. I mean, there's people I've never met in person, but if we're in the same city sometime, we can meet up, and we've been friends for years, and can pick up there. But it's something I find perplexing, to Zoomers, Gen Z people, like Facebook is like ancient technology. And the social media that's big is so small, and it doesn't even seem to facilitate even that small bit of community. Like TikTok, it's like minute-long videos and things like that. I don't get it, but also, I'm just a different time, things change and all that. But it seems to me that all of social media is heading in such a negative direction, where even the benefits it did give us are gone now. And that it I think there's lots of factors at play, like kids don't run around the neighborhood playing anymore. partly because in some places, if your kids were out running around, the police would be called,
Yeah.
or you could be, child protective services called on you. But also that, I mean, on the one hand, I get that raising kids is hard, but there's also let's give them an iPad and they can sit there on the couch while I get my work done kind of mentality that's cropped up. So I think that you're exactly right that we don't know where these technological innovations are leading. I mean, in the grand scale of human history, like the Industrial Revolution is still really new development, and before it's like, oh, the moldboard plow, such an innovation. That was the biggest news for decades. Now it's just like things that happened 5 years ago are ancient technology. Like just the internet itself, we've barely, I think, begun to explore all that and how it will factor into things. I also wanted to go back. You mentioned the Civil War and how that had a very negative effect on community. That's one of the main points Nisbet makes in The Present Age, is how the United States' militarism is driving so much atomism and the centralization of power. And I find that it's kind of an interesting contradiction that many people on the political right love American militarism and think it's so great, and at the same time they fail to understand this connection. Do you have any thoughts on why that is? And if I remember correctly, the Present Age, Nisbet delivered that at the Heritage Foundation as a series of lectures, didn't he? Or am I mistaken?
Yeah, I don't know. That was his Jefferson lectures, and I'm not sure the location.
Oh, okay.
It would have been in DC, and I'm not exactly sure where he was for that. It might have been. It seems like it should have been at a government.
Okay, yeah. For some reason,
but
I thought he gave something at Heritage dealing with militarism at some point.
He probably did. Yeah, he talked about it. I mean, it's in Quest for Community, and he talked about it all the way until the end of his career. He thought it was always had an atomizing influence, no matter what. In fact, even the rise of the political state, it only gets going. It's always in the context of war. Why does the Roman state arise? Is because of Augustus, a general, who how does it atomize people? Well, in ancient Rome, the way it worked was when soldiers went off to war, they were under their general while they were on campaigns, but when they returned to the city, they weren't under their general anymore. They were under the paterfamilias. And so the general didn't have authority over his own soldiers when he returned to Rome. And Augustus changes that. So the soldiers are under Augustus, which means they get to keep their loot. They don't have to give it to their family, but they're atomized. These other institutions don't have authority. If you cite as the soldiers being free from their families, well, it meant they were now more subject to the state. They may have really liked that because, Augustus was a charismatic and leader who did a lot for them, but it ends up weakening all of those opponents. So he had a very loyal military because of that. And the military militarization does that in all sorts of ways. In a time of war, it's a time of crisis. Everything else has to take second place. And sometimes, a time of crisis, you actually, that's just necessary for society to survive. But you want to do that as little as possible. So the problem with American history over the last century, as Nisbet sees it, is starting with World War I, we've been in perpetual war. So we're always, it was World War I, then it was World War II, only 2 short decades later, and then it's the Cold War in Vietnam and Iraq, and we were always at war with something. So everything else is always second place to it. And the growth of, he sees kind of the welfare warfare state as two sides of the same coin. So unfortunately, you end up with usually political parties who just pick a side of the coin they favor, but they're contributing to the same aspect of the growth of political power at the expense of social institutions. And again, sometimes we can see, social institutions can be oppressive. So sometimes we'll see where social institutions lose out to the political state, say in the civil rights movement. We see it as a moral advance. That was actually good that they lost in that circumstances. The problem is that they, a lot of the circumstances where they lose, it's very bad for the individuals who are part of them. We can, there are ways in which African Americans have been victims of that atomization process, very much so over the last three-quarters of a century. So all sorts of ways in which the state has grown is actually grown at the expense of African Americans. Interestingly enough, Putnam talks about how African American men were the most socially active in those new institutions in the early 20th century. They were the demographic out of everybody that was most likely to be involved in those sorts of institutions, and that's no longer true. But it's a very difficult concept in terms of getting to moral better society, because those social institutions can be oppressive, but they also are the very means often whereby you find not just escape from alienation, but also escape from oppression. So when you get the civil rights movements going, it happens in social groups. It's the NAACP, right, that champions it. It's a nonprofit organization, and that happens all the time. It's happening in social organizations that are formed precisely to deal with some sort of social oppression, and they're the ones who can really effectively combat them in a way that the problem with legal remedies is they're a blunt instrument. They often come in, shatter something, and maybe there's some good results. There's usually bad results too, because it's a sledgehammer they have to bring to it. It's the only tool the law has.
In the Quest for Community, Nisbet cites an essay called The Balance of Power in Society by another sociologist, Frank Tannenbaum, which is one of my favorite essays ever. I think it's just like overflowing with insights. And Tannenbaum argues that one, he attacks the Hegelian dialectics, this idea that there's two sides, and then we'll get the synthesis, and then there'll be peace, basically, that there'll be no conflict. And he has a funny line. It's like, conflict ceases only in death, and in a society where there's no conflict, it's a dead society. But that this conflict can be socially healthy when there are different institutions that are kind of vying against each other. Then it prevents one institution from gaining too much power and then using it for repressing other groups or their own members and things like that. Even among kind of the post-liberals, the idea seems to be, we need to empower the family, not by reducing the power of the state, but us seizing the power of the state and increasing it and using it to strengthen the family, which to me seems like that it's a zombie family institution then. So I had asked you about this way before, kind of overly broadly, but so what do you make of the critics who say that all this atomization is the result of free market capitalism?
Nisbet sees what's interesting is Nisbet's seen by libertarians as being anti-market, and he's seen by his leftist critics as being too pro-market. I can't both be right. He's I think his relationship to it is he sees it as a helpful economic system that depends on how it plays out. So he sees it as, and it's interesting, he's kind of ambivalent about the rise of multinational corporations, because he says, well, maybe this is helpful institutions that will kind of escape the nationalist scourge, because they work across borders, and this will kind of be a helpful long-term way of doing our economics that'll kind of lessen the powers of the nationalist impulse. It'll give us another loyalty, another sort of resource that's outside of the political state. So he's somewhat ambivalent when he's talking about it. He says we don't know exactly how these will play out, but they might actually be quite helpful in those along those lines. So he doesn't see the market as being necessarily acidic to communal bonds, but it can be. I think he sees it as it depends on the incentive structure that's going to be set up. Are you going to incentivize people to be little consumers, individualist consumers? Are you going to, when you set up your tax breaks and all of that, or are you going to set it up so that it engenders community? So we can think of this as, why do we have these, huge corporations which seem to be atomizing and how they operate? But as we basically, any libertarian knows, there's all sorts of laws that go into, including minimum wage laws, goes into suppressing smaller actors in entering certain markets, precisely so those big firms, and they're all behind that. They're behind the regulations. We all know this. So Nisbet was not, he was aware of that aspect. So when he's cautious about the free market, it's not so much the free market that he's after as what we call the free market, which is usually, which is not as free as kind of the idealist would like it to be. There's usually a structure of regulations that have gone into making this particular firms thrive and other firms fail. And so a Nisbettian libertarian might say, how can we reduce regulations or restructure them in such a way that it enables those smaller entities, which do actually bind people together. It's small businesses and that sort of thing. There, people work closely together. They end up becoming close friends, family businesses, these sorts of things. How can we help them thrive in this kind of new environment? And my suspicions are I'm not an expert in this area. There's a lot that could be done along those lines. This new environment is definitely presents novel challenges for us, but so did the Industrial Revolution, and we somehow managed to have a massive kind of social resurgence that took place after as the Industrial Revolution came in. All of these new groups come into existence. So, what would that look like today if we have the same thing? And I think we see there's some people who are thinking really hard about what it looks like, what building out a kind of productive household looks like. We don't have farms anymore, but that's okay. Maybe we can have this other way of doing it. And you and I are actually showing that right now. I think you're probably at home.
Yep.
I'm at home in my office, and I write it off on my taxes because I work from home. So there's kind of other ways we can think about how our houses, they kind of become a consumption good. But they don't have to be. That's kind of a limited way of thinking about them. Even in this new economy, there's all sorts of things we do actually at home that are economically productive, and probably with some creative thinking, I think that could continue. One of the things I love is, one of the things traditionalists decry was the decline in craftsmanship, right, with mass production of things. But you see a resurgence of craftsmanship right now because we can buy things. I don't really need an awesome, battle axe. And no one around me can make one, but because of the internet, I can buy one from that. His name? I think Michael Steele in the UK makes these, and so I could buy one if I wanted to with the Damascus steel.
The Etsy economy.
Yeah, so it's. I mean, it's these things that are actually really creative. It seems to me it's coming into existence, and how could we encourage that, or rather, what sort of barriers have we put in place that are kind of leftovers of the industrialized economy that really haven't made a good transition, or the early information economy, or the ways in which the kind of big players have rigged the game? How can we get rid of those sorts of regulations such that these smaller entities will really thrive, that actually are really socially Nisbettian good institutions for us?
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of thinking that can go in this direction.
Yeah, it's been interesting to me for a while. Well, in high school for a few summers, and then for maybe a little over a year before I went to grad school, I worked at this lawnmower shop that my uncle's family owns. And it was started by like my cousin's grandfather in like the 1950s. And it kind of fits in like this niche of providing like a level of service that you can't get if you go to Home Depot or something. And it just like people were willing, like it's a small family business, and that like they tell me they're swamped with work, and it's because it fits into this niche that large corporations aren't really in a position to fill. And it's like people have come there for 30 years and things like that. But also on the corporation thing, something I have been thinking about a lot for a while, but it's been renewed because of the Elon Musk and Twitter brouhaha. Nisbet cites Schumpeter and his criticism of kind of shareholder corporations, where Schumpeter basically says like there's literally no one who owns a corporation in the traditional sense of rights and responsibilities that come with ownership. The management has different incentives. Small-time shareholders have different incentives than larger shareholders, and the workers themselves have different incentives. And I I think it'd be very interesting if people did some more work exploring kind of these, in a way, negative incentive structures. And I also thought about it last year with all the meme stocks, where it's like all these people buying GameStop, and it's like the stock price, I think, is still higher than it was at its peak when it actually like did a lot of business and provided a service. It's like these people have no actual ownership
Right.
in this company and in the way it'd be traditionally explored. And I think there's lots of libertarians who wouldn't necessarily be hostile to further exploring that, but it just they haven't really. And I think that could be a way that the people should explore Nisbet and kind of potentially incorporate him into their own personal research programs. Um, and speaking of their own personal research programs, I wanted to make sure we had enough time to talk about your book that came out recently, well, relatively recently, Why Associations Matter, which is very good. And I reviewed it for the Mises Wire, which I'll post in the show notes. I thought it was really great on a lot of levels, especially as kind of an introductory, like a quick introduction to Nisbet without reading all of him. I mean, he's very productive, wrote a ton of books. You kind of give a really great summary of that. And then you apply it to the legal framework today and how that has kind of negatively affected communities, specifically when it comes to the right to disassociate, which is taboo in a lot of ways today. So why don't you tell listeners what you were trying to do with the book and just what you think it accomplishes?
Yeah. So thank you. Yeah. So my book, Why Associations Matter, it came out in 2020. So it's relatively recent. And there I criticize the court's jurisprudence on freedom of association. So basically, I take Nisbet, who says, we've very much lost our sense of what associations are. We don't even seem to think they exist anymore. We can talk about individuals, of course, kind of in these abstractions. And we can talk about the state and political power. But these are the only real things we seem to be able to talk about. We can't even talk about what associations are. They don't even seem philosophically to even have a place in our thought. And he gives, kind of a genealogy of why this is the case. Baudin, Hobbes, and Rousseau especially play a large role in why we probably think about that or don't think about them in our political theory. But he's a nice reading through the Supreme Court case law, it seemed to me the court was very much afflicted with a Hobbesian and Rousseauian way of thinking. So when it talks about freedom of association, it only talks about it in the context of either giving individuals a kind of microphone to express their own views, or in the democratic state's need for facilitating discussion among its citizens so as to be a democratic state. So those are, perfectly fine goals, but it seemed to me it was missing the broad swath of what associations actually accomplish, which most associations don't actually exist to facilitate our democratic procedures. They exist for their own purposes. Religious organizations exist to organize the proper worship of the divine. They're just, it turns out that the people who are involved in such associations tend to be better democratic citizens. That's the social science research seems to indicate that, but that's not why they're there. They're there for some other purpose. And in the freedom of association jurisprudence just does not get at this at all, really. And so it uses the concept of expressive association. So it'll protect associations insofar as they're expressive. So individuals can go into them, and they can participate in the democratic state in some way. But there's all sorts of associations that it would be hard to sell that they're really important to us, us as individuals, in terms of giving us membership and belonging and identity. But they're not actually expressive. So, religious organizations, for example, that's not their point most of the time, is to express their religious view. Their point is to get people to worship properly or to advance doctrine, but they're kind of inward focused. They're just talking to their own members. They're not actually really involved in what's going on out in the world necessarily, or only by extension. And the federal courts have explicitly denied freedom of association protections to fraternities and sororities because they're fraternal organizations. They're not expressive. And that strikes me as is completely missing the point. Why do we have freedom of association, which really ought to be anchored in the Assembly Clause, which the court has just completely forgotten about? Which John Inazu has an excellent book in 2012 called Liberty's Refuge. It's kind of a resuscitation of the Assembly Clause, which just protects peaceable assemblies. It doesn't say for what purpose.
Right.
If your purpose is fraternal, for Nisbet, that would be a very, very good purpose. Very, very important for what we know about human beings' psychological needs. And if they don't have those fraternal organizations of some sort, they as we talked about, they kind of fall into all sorts of kind of social pathologies, including following charismatic political figures. I kind of criticize the court for doing this and then kind of craft a remedy. So instead of talking about expressive association, the court should talk about functional autonomy. So is this group able to function for what it's for? And of course, can be exceptions to this. And for various reasons, we might make exceptions. If you're functioning for, it's the Church of Satan for the, sacrifice of children, we're not going to let you do that. But that should be the focus. So the focus is not on expression per se, although that's a perfectly very important function, but any function. So what are you trying to do? Are we trying to get together with friends so we can smoke cigars and talk about books? Is that your function? Okay. Is the state interfering with you doing that? So that would be the test. Is the state interfering with your functional autonomy? Your function is you're trying to smoke cigars and read books. Now, what the court would do right now is it would probably say, well, that doesn't look expressive, or it would say, well, we got to think of an expressive purpose that you have. You're reading books. Are they political books? Okay, I guess that would be an expressive purpose. And to me, that's not what it should be doing at all. It should be saying, are you peaceably assembling? Okay, that's it. Is your function to read books? Okay. Is your function just to talk? Okay, that's good. That's what we're looking at. So function, is it peaceable? And there might be a few other things that we have to bring into play, given our history, say with racism, for example, and exclusion. I give a couple of examples in the books where we might have to have a more complicated analysis, but for the most part, that should be the test. Is it functional autonomy? And that term I take out of Nisbet's book, The Twilight of Authority in 1975. And I think that would be a helpful way of reorienting our jurisprudence towards protecting associations as such, that are not state institutions, but are focusing on the social realm where individuals are accomplishing all sorts of functions that just really don't have anything to do with political power, but have to do with all the other things that we do in life.
So, do you think any the judicial classes, there's really, at least for the immediate horizon, any chance of moving in that direction? And especially, I ask in light of all the COVID lockdowns and everything here in Pennsylvania, where we both are. There was a court ruling where the judge was basically like, wow, all these state mandates were nuts. This is craziness, and you really overstepped your bounds. And part of me is hoping that the COVID lockdown craziness that has had so many negative health effects in more suicide attempts, increase in children obesity, alcohol abuse, the list goes on, that people will step back and say like, wow, we just did a really radical social experiment here, and we can see all kinds of negative results. We should think about this more. But on the other hand, like if it happened last week, it's ancient history. So I kind of worry that the lessons we could take away from the lockdowns might be forgotten. So what do you think legally going forward? Like, does the Federalist Society care about this at all? Or is it just kind of a few people spreading the good word right now, and we still have to get it out there more?
That's a good question. So I've been told there's one Supreme Court justice who has my book, and he's apparently looked at it. So we'll see if it has any effect. Justice Thomas did talk about the Assembly Clause in a concurrence last year. That scholarship has gotten a hearing in the federal courts as lately. So it seems like they're kind of reminded of, Justice Thomas, of course, kind of really picked up on the originalism of looking at the original understanding of the Assembly Clause and its history. So it's shown up that it might be there. And one of the other justices at least has a copy of my book and has looked at it. Don't know if he read it, but don't have anything in writing to that effect. But I've been told in a kind of a good authority that happens. So
That's
um,
exciting for sure.
yeah, so we'll see, and I do think yeah, I mean we'll see how things play out, but I think COVID did tell us how difficult not associating with each other actually is, how impossible and how deleterious it is. I mean, the kind of the most devastating thing for me is as reading about the childhood development delays. Because
Oh
you have
yeah.
very small windows. They, you pick up a certain skill during this window, or you never get it. It's very quick that those pass. So you can't. And Nisbet talked all about our associations with each other is how we develop as human beings. But we know this from developmental psychology is that if you don't is you get everything from interactions with other people. In fact, if you aren't, held a lot as a infant, you don't develop communicative faculties. I mean, so it's so essential that human beings interact with each other from the very beginning up through. And so, I think was it the CDC or kind of changed its
Oh right.
dates. Yeah. So it said, oh, well, we'll just say, you can be 3 years old or whatever when you develop. And it's like, that's not how it works. We know
Yeah.
those windows pass very quickly.
Yeah,
And we have to have them.
that was one of the most fascinating things. I did some reading a few years ago. I mean, there's not many case studies, but about case studies of severely isolated children, kind of like also sometimes called feral children. And it's just truly astonishing the level, how much damage it did to them. And I mean, they could not, they had great difficulty just even learning to talk, and even with recognizing objects and things. It's just like literally there can't be this blank slate state of nature human. I mean, if you just drop a human on an island, and even if they have enough food, they're not going to develop at all, really. It's kind of scary to think about. So yeah, I mean, hopefully people will think about it more. And I mean, just, I mean, I've witnessed it myself. People seem to have gone a little nuts during the lockdowns and everything. I mean, I think a lot of issues went into all the protests that sometimes turned into violent riots. I mean, I think part of that was everyone was going a little nuts from being stuck inside. And yeah, hopefully people will think more about that. So before we go, I also wanted to pivot and talk about the Academy of Philosophy and Letters, which you're the current president of. And I attended a meeting a few years ago and am excited to be attending this year. And I think it's not a ton of people know about it, but I think that a lot of listeners, it might be of interest to them, and there's still time to register if people would be interested in attending. So why don't you tell us what it all is about and what makes it unique among the huge proliferation of academic conferences that are out there these days?
Yeah, sure. So the Academy of Philosophy and Letters is an organization that was formed 12, 15 years ago, something like that, to offer a place for people who didn't quite fit into a lot of the so probably were members of, but didn't fit into a lot of the other organizations, the Philadelphia Society, in places like that, that people were members there, but maybe felt like they needed something more or something a little different. So it tends to have a bit of a traditionalist and kind of there's some classical liberals involved, as well as some traditionalist conservatives, but people who are concerned about the direction that the major institutions within kind of the DC establishment were going. With the Iraq War, for example. So a lot of the big DC institutions just jumped on board right away with it. And the founders of the Academy of Philosophy and Letters were a little suspicious that they weren't taking the long view of the kind of a Nisbettian sense, you might say, of the effects that war can have. So Saddam Hussein was not a good guy. We know that there were some terrorist organizations over, at least in Afghanistan, and there were some things that needed to be done. But probably they were kind of among the first to sound the alarm bells that this is not going to be as easy as everyone says. War tends to be destructive at home. tends to be destructive abroad. There's very serious ramifications. You don't go into it lightly. And they thought, rightly as it turned out, that it was that we were going to it a little too lightly. So that was the kind of origins of it. But the goals of the organization are much broader. So it's just thinking through culture, the interaction between politics and culture and economics in a very broad sense, in a very you might say the long sense, historically, taking a long view of how these things develop and what the future might hold. So the topic for this year is looking backward to move forward. So thinking about crisis periods, and we just are in the middle of one right now, crisis periods in the past and how they might apply to the present. So we've been through crisis periods before. We've even been through pandemics before. But what exactly were the lessons that we should learn from all those crisis periods, and how do they apply today? So you are going to be presenting on a panel at that conference, and I'll be kind of emceeing along the way as president. But it takes place June 2nd through the 4th. It's in College Park, Maryland, at the College Park Marriott there. So you can register at philosophyandletters.org. They have a registration link there, and you can book your room. The link's right there for the Marriott, and it should be a good time. So I think we have some very interesting speakers. Justin Schubaugh will be there discussing architecture and kind of what went wrong with architecture. So he had served on a commission that deals with I can't remember the name of it, deals with the architecture in DC and tries to preserve it.
Right, yeah.
So should be very interesting. So we have some others, prominent speakers. Sam Goldman will be discussing pluralism with another guy, his name escapes me at the moment, who will be discussing kind of a nationalism pluralism debate that we have going on, exactly where America should fit into that broad debate. So it should be a good time. Usually brings up some very good discussions, brings together some, we usually have around 50 or 60 people that show up, but it's a lot of them are kind of heavy hitters, I guess, in the intellectual world. So multiple books to their names and that sort of thing. So it's a really good time to kind of get to FaceTime with a lot of those figures.
Yeah, I can
some
definitely.
of your former professors.
Yeah, I can attest that I had an amazing time when I went in 2018. I think everyone was very friendly, and you're right, there were prominent people there in a rather intimate setting. I learned a lot, had a lot to think about, and so it was the mask mandate was just canceled for all the flights and the trains and everything. So if listeners have been thinking about making a trip now, I would suggest that this is a good one to think about, especially also if you're in the DC area, close by and everything. And another thing that I appreciated about the meeting is that it was not only tenured academics. I mean, I'll be on a panel and I'm just a freelance writer in my basement, but also there's people associated with think tanks, but also I think one of the board members is a musician, a classical musician and all that. And I know that a lot of people who are listening are academically inclined. So what are your thoughts on the state of academia today? Because I mean, I'm very black-pilled on it. I dropped out of the political theory program at Catholic University of America, which is where you received your PhD. And I mean, I love ideas, but I increasingly think academia is the place that hates ideas and not that great. So I'm just curious, what do you think's happening, and what's your advice to smart people who like learning and have thought about going to grad school?
Yeah, good question. So yeah, it's I mean, one thing to keep in mind, and this is just a practical matter, is enrollments are declining, and it looks like that decline is going to continue. So which means the job market's gotten kind of astronomically more difficult over just the last few years. So I started grad school in 2010, and the decline started in 2011. So it was about the worst timing imaginable. And so it's something to keep in mind that it's a far harder in the job market than it was just a few years ago. So just older cohorts of grad students had an easier time than will current cohorts. So keep that in mind. Just as a practical matter, it's nobody's kind of ideological fault, at least not kind of in the immediate sense. Long-term sense, we can blame it on things, but in the immediate sense, that's just kind of a practical fact. Academia is very much in flux. It's hard to know exactly where we're headed. So we have a very prominent kind of free speech crises that are happening, and critics of kind of the alarmists are saying, we have this free speech crisis because we have all these incidents that keep happening. But, critics of that position are, well, those get attention because they're relatively rare. I mean, it's probably not going to happen to you. And if it does, fortunately, you have a lot of case law on your side, and organizations like the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, the National Association of Scholars, and the Institute for Humane Studies that'll have your back along the way.
And you worked at FIRE for several years, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So
yes.
You know what you're talking about.
Yes. So there's that. I mean, and there's some institutions that definitely seem to have a toxic culture. Fortunately, I'm one that does not. So Duquesne's, it seems very healthy, ideologically diverse, and just collegial among professors. So especially in my department, the political science department, and it's really just a wonderful place to be. So there are places that are perfectly healthy places to be, as far as I can tell. So it's it's not all bad. I think that the biggest thing is to just keep in mind that with enrollments declining, and academia in some ways, people talk about the ideological nature, but there's also kind of the specialization problem. So everyone is really, even me, I focus on, one clause in the Constitution, which is a big, relatively big document when you think about it. And you end up kind of across academia, people working on very narrow niche stuff to create novel arguments and scholarship. But the problem is it's harder to see the relevance of it. So I think that the stat is that every journal article is read 2.5 times on average. And, that's you spend a year or 6 months at least working on an article to make some point, and, 2 people read it. And something like 18% of humanities articles are even cited. So I suspect that, in those citations, of course, doesn't mean they read it. They just had to cite it because they need citations in their footnotes. So it's, seeing things as, what is really the point of all this? And Nisbet actually points out that a lot of the research that happens in universities could just as easily happen at corporations, or, especially in like the sciences. I mean, why do you have some professors working on that when really it just should be some, Bayer or something should just be having the studies, so we can learn stuff about it. And there's some truth to that. There's some studies that some other institutions might be able to take over, and there's worry that that's exactly what's going to happen. They'll start outsourcing them, or not outsourcing, that's the wrong word, but they'll move elsewhere. But I think universities, they're kind of a unique institution, and melding together, at least many of them, a liberal arts education, so giving you a broad education as well as giving you this important research component, advancing knowledge and preserving knowledge at the same time, and passing it on. And so, we need those functions. They're absolutely essential. And some of them, it's hard to say if they're going to stay in the university or if they're going to go outside of it. So I wouldn't say I'm optimistic about them staying in the university, but it seems to me that at least some universities, I think my own institution, among others, might be able to kind of hold that together. Now, what I think will happen is that some institutions that choose not to do that, either because they want to go too much in the technical kind of route, will end up not existing, I guess. So if you want to just do kind of technical research, there's really better institutions that'll do that, and they can take government grants too. So there's other, and they end up I think they'll end up kind of getting cannibalized by those other institutions. So I'm having in mind corporations and the Rand Corporation, places like that.
Yeah,
I think will take over and in the coming decades, I think those places that choose to go that route, I think they'll go under by and large. And then the kind of the ideological route, I think it'll be something similar. I think, I don't care where you sit ideologically. When you send your kids to college, you just want them to get an education. You don't want them to get an ideology of either side. It's just not what you're interested in. You would have sent them to intern at, the RNC or the DNC if you want, which some people do. That's a perfectly fine thing to do.
Yeah.
But it's not what you're looking for. You're hoping that they're going to, read some good books, and they're going to come away a deeper, more thoughtful person at the end of it that's going to be not just economically productive, but socially productive. And if colleges and universities aren't going to deliver that, those places that don't deliver that, I think parents are, as we speak, wisening up to it, and they're going to send them to places that do, or keep them out and send them to trade school or something else. And so I think institutions that realize like the real niche that universities actually can fulfill in terms of research and teaching and actually can do a good job in, is if they stick to that mission, I think those ones will, over the decades in the long haul, I think they have a future, because I think that need is kind of uniquely fulfilled by universities, but ones that want to be either kind of ideological in one way or the other, niches, I don't think that the market will be there for them. I think there's other institutions that do a better job, and same with kind of technical research. I think there's other institutions that could take over. And if they want to just become only, a university in name only because they do this other thing, I think funders and parents and students are going to wisen up to it. And I don't think there's a bright future for them.
Yeah, and I think in a way that this downsizing is gonna it's gonna in a way clear a lot of the dead wood, both on both sides, both on the faculty side, but also on the student side, because
Right.
I mean, I like a liberal education. I mean, as I have this huge library behind me, but that's not my experience with a lot of my peers when I was an undergrad, and even then, I think my perspective was skewed because everyone I hung out with was at least intellectually curious. And when I was a TA in grad school, I was like horrified by some of the students who had no intellectual curiosity. I mean, I thought it was on the one hand hilarious, on the other hand, it was horrifying. There were students in intro to politics who wanted to work in politics and were going to school in DC. They didn't know who Mitch McConnell was. It took 5 tries for the professor to get someone to say who the Senate Majority Leader was at the time. And so I think a lot of people are wasting their time in college, but as those people go away, kind of as you're saying, enrollment's going down and all that, I really hope that the schools will refocus, and the students who who do go will be enriched and want to be enriched as well, and won't be wasting their money as much. But
Right.
thank you so much for coming on. We're out of time, but I think it was a really great discussion, and I definitely recommend everyone check out Why Associations Matter. It's a great introduction to Nisbet, and I'd also encourage people to look into attending the Academy of Philosophy and Letters this year. It's coming up quickly, but I think if you go, you'll have a really great time. So thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
You can see more of Luke's work on his website, which I've included in the show notes. And if you are interested in attending the Academy of Philosophy and Letters meeting, the deadline for registration and hotel bookings is coming up, and I've also included a link for that as well. If you're new to the Republic of Ezo, I'd like to welcome you again and encourage you to join our Discord server and to follow us on Twitter. And if you'd like to help support making more of these episodes, feel free to contribute on Patreon. I am your host, Zach Yost. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, bye-bye.